Good evening, everybody. It is that time of the week again where we can gather together and discuss the gospel and hopefully how it applies to the higher gospel. And we need a volunteer today for an opening prayer.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
O God, the eternal Father, we thank thee that we may be gathered together here over our phones. We ask thee to please bless us with thy Holy Spirit. Please bless that we may hear what is in thy will and that we may learn thy gospel, that we may share and come together closer, that we may be a family together with thee. In the name of Yeshua Messiah. Amen.
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 My, what a deep voice you have.
Who, me?
No, him.
Oh, yeah.
It changed.
Sounded like there was a young child going to pray. Then all of a sudden, young child
Is matured. It's a
That's-
bait and switch, as we call it.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what a deep voice you have, Grandma. What big ears you have, Grandma.
Yeah. There you go. So, I really have not a very good idea of what to speak of this evening, except that I had like a couple of ideas, two ideas, but I'm not sure how well they go together. So, I guess we'll just start with one. I'd like to start with the higher gospel. You know, the Hebrews were given the gospel through Abraham. Abraham had learned it from Noah, Melchizedek, depending upon which scriptures you read, of course, to find out which ones he was contemporary with. And then Abraham, of course, taught it to his son and his all his sons and his grandchildren. But then after a while, there came a great famine in the land, and Jacob had to leave his homeland and go to Egypt to try and find food. And so he sent his sons to go and try and find food. And we all know the story of how Joseph ended up in Egypt and all of that. But then Jacob decided at the end there to go to Egypt as well, and his son would take care of him in his old age. And the Israelites got very used to city life. They got very used to it, and the gospel became tainted more and more and polluted more and more. And when Moses came along, Moses taught the gospel again. But the people were so addicted to city life and all the bad behavior that goes along with it. They were so addicted that they didn't even know it was bad behavior. I mean, they were so used to it. It was so much regular behavior for them, regular part of life, that they actually didn't even know how wicked they were. And, we look at the gospel that they were taught by Moses, and we think, well, they should have easily understood, not to be killing each other, but yet they had to get a commandment not to kill each other. They should have easily understood not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to lie, but they had to be told those things. And it was hard for them to follow these very basic rules in society because their society, Egypt was so polluted that it just seemed like normal behavior. You know, you get angry enough at somebody, you get into an altercation, pretty soon somebody gets beat or hurt or killed, and someone else ends up in jail or whatever it may be. And it seems very common. You know, they hear it on the news living in Egypt. The town crier goes around, you know, George got put in jail for killing the other guy over there, or whatever it was. And people just sort of shake their heads. Oh, silly George. We knew he'd get caught someday. And that's it. It doesn't even bother them that they were actually that they live like that. You know, they enjoy blood sports, going to the UFC, watching the fighting championships, watching somebody's arm get broken or whatever, and they cheer on the whichever psycho, you know, fighter is going at the other guy, and they look at it as if it's not really a bad thing, and they try and justify it somehow by saying, oh, it's only self-defense that I would ever use it for. I'm just learning, blah, blah, blah. You know, and they get so used to it, they don't even know that they are enjoying evil. So the Lord has to give them a commandment that says, you know, you guys really got to stop hurting each other, stop killing each other. And he has to, Moses has to break that down into laws later on. He breaks it down that, hey, somebody punched you and you lost your eye, you went blind in one eye, and now their family wants to kill the other family and everything to exact their pound of flesh, but the Lord has to actually give them rules, and Moses gives them a rule saying, hey, you're not allowed to do more back to the person than what they did to you in the first place. Otherwise, that wouldn't be justice, you know. You're only allowed, you're supposed to forgive, but if you can't forgive, you're only allowed a tooth for a tooth. You know, you're not allowed to exact more of a penalty than that because the people were psycho, right? You know, and we have a lot of this today in our day. We have a great deal of this today. We have a lot of blood sport today. We have a lot of competition, and we cheer these guys on. They make, you know, millions of dollars for these blood sports, you know, and we watch movies about them and everything, and we think, you know, we're not that bad, but we're just so used to such a degradation. We're so used to so much evil that we think we're not bad. Well, what more could we do that's bad? You know, kill each other? Well, we are. You know, what more can we do? Let people get away with killing each other? We do. What more can we do? Adultery? My goodness, that one, people love watching movies about adultery and books and, you know, songs and music and everything else, all about it. And it's like one of the best sellers ever. I mean, if you want to sell a product, you know, you get a young girl who's well endowed to be your spokesperson, and you seem to sell more of your product. And why is that? Well, because, you know, that promiscuity or the thought of it sells. We are so evil of a society that we actually don't think we're that bad when we promote a tremendous amount of evil. I mean, we bear false witness. That guy thinks this, that guy thinks that. We're not in his head. We don't know what he thinks. We're bearing false witness as soon as we say it. You know, we bear false witness all the time when we gossip. We bear false witness in a lot of things, and a lot of times we bear false witness about ourselves, and we make excuses for that behavior. And we are so in such a wicked society. We even call some of our lies white lies, as if they were somehow good and acceptable. What are we going to say next? White murder? I mean, it's really crazy the amount of evil that we do as a society, and we think we are not that bad. And yet, if Moses came today, he'd have to be giving us those 10 commandments again. He'd have to be giving us rules to govern, how many times we're allowed to watch a bad movie, how many times we're allowed to listen to bad songs. He'd have to be giving us rules and punishments for it, because we actually think we're growing up and we can do as much evil as we want, and we should still be allowed to go to heaven and all of that. That's kind of an odd thing, don't you think? It seems kind of odd that we actually think we're not that bad, and yet our whole lives revolve around evil. We can't wait till we're done work so that we can do something evil. I want to go home and relax and maybe glut myself in front of the television watching the latest blood sport movie and killing everybody and adultery in there, everything else you can possibly think of, and I just want to relax and absorb more of this wickedness, put more in. And that's our, I mean, I'm not saying everybody's like that. It's just such a society norm that these kinds of things happen. And we get so used to it, we don't even think that it's bad. We think we're not that bad. And it's kind of an odd thing. And so we have these things that we're taught. Moses had to teach people that were kind of wicked like that, and he had to teach them that if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, there was a punishment affixed to it. He didn't call it karma or natural consequences, although sometimes you would think that it was, but he would say that God would punish you if you ate bad food, for example. Well, eating bad food, has its own punishments, and it doesn't come like a person in the sky there saying, this guy keeps doing it, I'm going to curse him now. It doesn't work like that. It works because of natural consequences. You start eating food that has been, you take a jar of mayonnaise and sit it in your car, in the dash of your car, and then start eating it after it has a nice time to warm up there. And, we're not going to say that God's the one making you sick. We're going to say you're an idiot for eating that. And you go get a nice gas station sandwich and that's been sitting there. It was made fresh last year, and we're going to say that it's God punishing us. And so you gotta wonder sometimes where our mind really is, and maybe we've eaten too many of those sandwiches that it's killed off too many brain cells, because it actually has a consequence of its own. Even when you get into an altercation with somebody and somebody loses sight in their eye because of a big right hand come and bonk them right in the eye, and they go blind in that eye. And it's not God punishing that now there's a family feud. It it's us. It's a natural consequence. And when the Lord came, he tried to get people out of that way of thinking that God was this great magician in the sky who would punish or reward you according to what you did. And he's tried very hard to help people understand, because even at the time, if you remember in the scriptures, it teaches that if you did something wrong and you broke the law of Moses or the law of God, you would then be punished, or your family would be punished in some way. Somebody would get sick, somebody would become a cripple, somebody would be possessed by a devil. There was always a punishment that they claimed happened because God got mad at you because of something you did wrong. And so when the Lord came, he tried to teach people very carefully that these things had their own consequences, and that God was giving nice advice as to how to keep those consequences from happening to us. Now, for myself, I have noticed that um, the more that we share this information with people, the more they seem to misunderstand. They still think, okay, well, that could be the case, and why is God punishing me? They still come out with that question. For example, everybody remember the story of Tobit in the Old Testament there. If you're Catholic, it's in your Bible. If you're not, it may not be in your Bible, but it's in the apocryphal books. But the book of Tobit is an interesting story. Tobit was a guy who was ended up in captivity with the Babylonians. And he was always a righteous guy, though. And he always would keep all the commandments. And he would always share what little means he had with other people. When he would sit down to eat, he would bring people in, find somebody who was homeless and bring him in off the street and feed him. He was a very conscientious guy. And when the king got mad and would punish people and kill people, the king liked to leave the bodies in the streets to warn his other subjects, his citizens, that if you do wrong, this is going to be your punishment. But Tobit was a very conscientious guy toward the Lord, and so anytime it was a Jewish person who was killed, Tobit would go and get the body and bury the body, and he would try to do that, of course, before sunset, following the laws and all of that kind of stuff. And of course the king got angry at him and went after him and his family, and they ended up having to run off and live in a cave for a while, and until that king was replaced by another king, and then Tobit got to come back out. And Tobit would again, anytime there were dead of his own people, he would run off and take care of that, bury them, and all of that kind of stuff, even without tending to himself. He wouldn't eat, and he would go fasting to go do that, and so he always took care of everybody he could, and took care of the living as well. While he was doing this, one night he got back pretty late. He was pretty tired. He laid down by the fence, and there were some birds in the trees that while he was laying down to sleep after burying the dead, the birds pooped in his eyes, and it caused a him to go blind. And of course, people made fun of him and everything else because, you know, God's punishing you. He didn't protect you. And you must not have been doing good. And what good does it do to keep the commandments and all of that sort of thing? And same kind of response as Job got in the Old Testament, you know. And so Tobit got this response, and he had difficulty with his family as well, and his family wasn't very happy with his serving the Lord when he was having to suffer. And of course, then they had to suffer because then, of course, he couldn't make a living. His wife had to try and bring food for the family, all that kind of stuff. And there was some problem there. But later on, at the end of the book, we find out Raphael, an angel, is there, and he's explaining things and how, you know, it was the swallows, the birds, that were the one who was to blame for making him go blind. It wasn't God. It was the birds. And we find out that the Lord, you know, allowed such a thing to happen because he wanted to show forth what a righteous man does under problems, even something serious as going blind. And the Lord did make a way that eventually his son Tobias was instructed by the angel how to actually anoint his eyes, his dad's eyes, to heal him, you know. And it's a very interesting thing. We have a lot of people in the scriptures, and many examples in the scriptures, where something happens. We have the story of Job, where many things happened to Job, and Job kept being good anyways. And you know, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who suffered a lot. We have Noah, who suffered a lot. We have a lot of the prophets who suffered a great deal of things, a lot of them who ended up killed and stoned to death, and sawn in half, and burned alive. And many of these horrible things have happened to the prophets. And we always wonder, you know, where was God, and why didn't he protect them? And yet the Lord has come out to say that it wasn't him punishing them. And he was very happy when these prophets showed forth good examples in their suffering. And he's trying to show us this gospel of how to be good through all sorts of difficulties. And so I guess I'm drawn between these kinds of ideas. One, the higher gospel. We really have to get people to understand the higher gospel, that the Lord is offering us advice to try and show us how to become, you know, a son of God, a daughter of God. And when good things or when bad things happen to good people, whether it's by your own hand or by someone else's hand, how do you respond to that? Do you still respond in a good way? And of course, this is the higher gospel, and the whole reason for it is so that we can build ourselves into the type of person that the Lord is, and the type of person that he is. And we have I guess we have these kinds of things, and to me, all these things go together, because they have, when we look and we're trying to find God and we can't, when we're trying to hear God and we can't, and we grade on a curve. We think that since we live in society, I'm better than 90% of society. So everything should be okay, when we're not really realizing that we're very degraded ourselves, that we do put a lot of that evil into us. And then when we put a lot of that evil into us, we have all these really bad consequences that come in our lives. And they could be various consequences, physical ailments, financial problems, relationship problems, all sorts of various um, um, bad situations can come. And then we don't respond well to these things because we think we're already doing good. And we wonder where God is, and we question our faith, and we kind of are not certain how to view things anymore. And we pray for deliverance, and we're right back to that magic God again, praying for him to wave his magic wand and make everything all better, instead of asking for that advice, that asking him to show us our problems, where we've gone wrong, and then asking for advice how to fix that, and do that meditation we talked about last week, so that we can actually hear the answer and repair our lives. But instead, we kind of stay believing that we're not that bad, or even some of us are even so vain as to call ourselves good. And yet we're flooding ourselves with all of these negative things, bad things, and we still have the audacity to call ourselves good. And then when we have consequences to those negative things, even though we think we're smart, we're not even smart enough to realize how those consequences come. What's that tell you? And yet we don't respond well when those consequences do come. We just start begging the Lord to, make the consequences magically go away. And so we have this gospel that we are taught, that you can ask the Lord for what the problem is that you're doing wrong, and he'll reveal it to you. We have this gospel that says, you learn to quiet your mind and your heart, and meditate on this, and he will tell you. You can hear him. He doesn't just bless you for it. He's already talking. It's you that chooses to bless yourself for it by being quiet and listening. And then you do the type of meditation that we talked about last week, and so that you don't make those mistakes again, no matter what the pressure that is placed upon you. And then we can learn then not to put all that worldly filthiness, the entertainment that we think is not that bad, into us. And we can learn how to think properly, and how to feel properly, so that we can have
Hey, Joseph, if you can hear, you're frozen. Well, if anybody can hear, I suspect he'll be joining us back again. He had some sort of communication breakdown, which is not unusual.
I think they're probably quite a ways from a cell tower. I think that's maybe part of the issue.
Yeah.
So it's spotty.
Oh, we're back.
Here we are.
He's back.
We are back, except we look like we're frozen.
And you didn't even look cold.
Yes. Many are called, but few are frozen.
Yep. And why are they not frozen?
Because they didn't learn this one lesson. Put wood in the fire, get a coat.
That the rights of the heater are inseparably connected.
Yeah, no kidding. Anyways, I have no idea how long I was talking after it disappeared.
Oh, I'd say about 2 minutes at best.
Oh, there you go. Well, that was about most of everything that I had to say, anyways, that I was thinking about. And I often think about these things because when I talk with new people, it seems to be one of the biggest challenges and the hardest things for people to accept. I'm not sure if I was talking very coherently anyways, but
You were.
You were very easy to understand, very simple.
yeah.
And yet it's something we all miss. We've been raised with a false tradition in the lower gospel. And so understanding things in a higher level, I think, takes a few years, a few times to really evaluate, what's happening. People blame God for everything. It's kind of silly.
Yeah, it's very odd to me. I just can't figure it out.
They seek to cover their sins.
Yeah,
121st section.
yeah, absolutely.
People are always looking for a scapegoat, and we don't need to look too far in some cases.
Well,
Maybe
like
just years.
Tobit says, cover your eyes so the bird can't poop in it. It's a good rule.
Yeah, no kidding. If you're gonna lay down under their nest,
Well, how about this? If
come a little closer. if you want.
if Tobit was following all the Jewish rules, then isn't he supposed to go and wash and clean himself after dealing with burying a dead body?
Yeah, of course. Wash his
And-
body and wash his clothes and wait till sundown and wait till them to dry and wait till sundown before you can come back.
Yeah, but if he paused, if he got tired and went to lay down somewhere, maybe he didn't actually go and wash yet. So that could have been. I mean, if he
Could
had
be.
gone and washed, then he wouldn't have been in that position.
That is true. That is true.
And the fact that he fasted while he was dealing with the dead bodies, which is generally a good idea because you really don't want to be eating and handling dead bodies at roughly the same time.
Of course. I think it's very interesting. I really like that line. The Lord allowed it, and you're thinking, why did He allow it? Well, He allows for you to make stupid mistakes too.
That's always something I find funny. People will ask, why does the Lord allow so much bad to happen? But they never ask, why did the Lord make me do this horrible thing? Or their own mistake, their own evil. And they're like, oh, well, that's because I did it. I chose it. And they don't seem to get that. Yes, everybody can choose.
Yeah, everybody has their agency, and the Lord cannot take away agency. So it really makes no sense why anyone would blame the Lord for stupid things they did or the results of the things they did.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of the talk I gave on conference, the story about the Jewish teacher when someone asked, why did God create atheists?
Oh yeah.
Because they thought that they were being clever, and you know, even though the rabbis probably like, you didn't create, they have their own, they have their own choice. And he knew that wouldn't solve anything, so he did his own story.
I know,
That's
he
like,
made up a nice story.
yeah.
Yep. I can't figure out why that story would have worked anyways, because that would have mean that people listening would have had to have an ulterior motive to be being good in the first place. So once you have an ulterior motive, your intentions are not pure, therefore you're going to hell anyway. Nothing's
Yes.
gonna work.
Well,
So
I have a feeling that the rabbi was talking to people very much like the people Moses was talking to people.
yeah,
They had
yeah,
to uh, they had to dumb things down a little bit.
yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure why, but I definitely think there's a problem there. Anybody else have any comments that might go well?
I'll unmute. I've had a thought because I think about this sometimes. I was raised with a lot of false concepts. And so I'm always trying to think of how to phrase things or how to explain things. And of course, you've got it down. You've got a pretty good system that works. And that's why it's always nice to listen to you explain how things go. But a lot of people we deal with in that Christian tradition, it's hard to, unless they're willing to listen quite a bit, it takes some period of time to try and get them to understand these concepts. You've used that phrase, the magic God kind of thing. Well, that's exactly what everybody wants to believe, I profess, I like you, you're so cool. Boom, boom, he's going to wave that magic wand and cure all the ills that afflict us. So this makes really good stuff to think about and kind of get in our own minds the way we can teach it.
That is the biggest problem that I find is how to actually share this information. So many people would like, I like the analogy of of a chef. You have a very famous chef, one of the most famous in the world, and he starts a chef school, and people go from all over the world go to this school to learn how to be great chefs, and then all of a sudden you have somebody who starts complaining. I showed up every day. uh, I've been trying to study. Sometimes I open a book. I'm not going to follow those recipes because I don't like some of those ingredients. They should pass me. The great chef should pass me and make me into a world-class chef. And you're thinking, that's dumb. And another person's there it refuses to learn the ingredients and how to mix them together, refuses to learn the recipe, and in what order, won't follow the proper order of mixing them together, and his souffle always turns out flat and dense. Well, the great chef should just wave his magic spatula over my souffle and make it fluffy. I think the great chef is bad because he won't just make mine turn out. I should be able to do it my own way, and he should say that I have the greatest souffle there ever was, right? I mean, you start talking like this, and people think you're an idiot. The great chef dies, and someone else is running the school, and the new students come in and say, "You're not the great chef. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to do it my own way." Uh, I've been in over under the Bodhi tree meditating, and the great chef appeared to me and told me to 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 use a fork instead of a spatula, and that's what I'm going to do. And even if you fail me, the great chef will allow me to cook in his restaurant in the sky. It gets so dumb.
I think we saw
They'd
that.
fail that guy so fast. They'd get all those people, they'd flunk them out of school so fast. It's just because it becomes silly.
I think we saw that in the Ratatouille movie. It's
Yeah,
basically the
it doesn't
plot.
make any sense. I'm going to do it my way. I'm not going to follow the recipe. And the great chef is just going to magically make it turn out right somehow. It gets kind of stupid. You go to university and start telling the professor that. See how long you last. And yet, here we are when it comes to religion, we believe that nonsense. We actually believe that just because we're rebellious, but we have a good heart, that's why we're being so evil, rebellious. And he's just going to make it magically work out, and there's nothing you can do about it. It really sounds kind of odd, and it doesn't work that way. The Lord wants us to become his sons and his daughters. The Lord wants us to become like him. That means we would need to do things as he does things. Not, we're just going to follow the Spirit, and whatever I feel like doing that day, I'm going to do. That doesn't make us become like him. When we decide, everything belongs to the Lord, so I'm going to steal your stuff, then, and the Lord says it's okay, so I'm following the Spirit. That doesn't sound very good to me. But I've heard that. I've had people tell me these things. And it's no wonder that they cannot hear God.
Well, comment. People are always looking for reasons to justify their actions. And I think that with every action that we have, there is one immutable law from the Lord that says that there's always a consequence to an action, whatever it is. And if they're looking for ways to skirt what the Lord has already told us is right, and he's told us what is wrong, and we choose to go into our own little dream world and think that we're being instructed by the Lord to do something that he's already told us is a sinful thing to do, it doesn't make sense to begin with. He's already told us that if you sin, there's going to be consequences to that. Unless even when you do repent, there's still consequences to it. And we just have to do that. He's not going to tell you anything to do anything that he's already told you is wrong or that is forbidden. He just won't do that. But a lot of times people have a hard time accepting that because it makes it very difficult for them to get around skirting God's laws and God's commandments. So it's just not how he operates. They're too
Well, if the
busy
Lord
doing
really
wrong.
does, yeah,
Go
if the
ahead.
Lord really does want us to become like him and have the same abilities and all that kind of stuff, then he's going to teach us how to do it.
Right.
If he's teaching us how to do it, then it comes down to the fact that it's us choosing. If we
Right.
follow his ways, we get those results. If we don't get those results, then we are not following his ways. No matter how much we say we are not doing it. And no matter how much and then, you always hear the excuse where they turn back to that magical God. Well, he'll still let me be celestial and all that. Well, I can tell you, if you go to the celestial glory and you see how hard people are working and how strict they are in keeping themselves uh, to a much deeper law, then how are you going to feel even though you get in there? You can't do it. You're going to feel pretty bad about yourself when everyone else is keeping it strictly and you can't. You're going to feel pretty miserable about yourself. So I don't think it's necessary to worry about where you're going as much as who you're going to be when you get there. If we are going to be like the Lord, then we should follow the instructions the Lord gave, because he only gives instructions to make us like him. And if we think any other way, then we're bearing false witness against him. And, that's definitely not a good thing. You can't, there's no forgiveness for going against the Holy Ghost. So,
Joseph, it seems that I've thought about this before. There's a difference between letting him teach us how to do something and letting us do it. But I think sometimes people view that magic God comes in and does everything for us. He comes in and solves all our problems with very little effort on our part. And I think we don't progress unless we have to really wrestle with some things and learn the principles and then apply them. We're trying to become gods. We're trying to become exactly what he became by showing us the path to follow. So I think sometimes we expect the Lord will solve all of our problems just without us putting in some really tough effort. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Abraham had family problems. Isaac had children problems. Jacob had, all kinds of problems. And these problems never went away their whole lives. Nobody swooped down and fixed them. They were just taught, by the Lord to how to deal with those problems. And the same thing with Father Lehi there. He had some problems and he was only taught how to deal with those problems. And the same thing with Nephi and all the other guys there in that book. They were taught how to deal with the problems. Problems never went away. And a lot of these guys had physical ailments that never went away. Like Jacob had his hip was injured for the rest of his life. Paul was a guy who went to the Lord 3 times to ask about getting his side healed there. He had to live with that the rest of his life. How do we deal with these issues? I think that is why we are here, to become good people, to deal with things properly. And, everything we try and share on here has been to try and help people actually be able to get to the Lord, to hear him, and to understand what is expected. And sometimes we get questions as, like, well, how long do I have to follow this gospel before the Lord gives me my own magic wand and I don't have to follow it anymore? And you're wondering, where you went wrong in sharing the gospel. There is no time where you will get a magic wand and not have to do things yourself. The whole idea is that the Lord will raise up more lords. That's why he's called the Lord of Lords. And he's wants for us to become like him. So you are able to do the work and not just have him bail you out. I don't know. I feel very bad for so many of the folks that I teach that can't seem to grasp this concept, and I feel bad because I feel like I'm just not good at explaining things very well, and it's important. If you actually want the results, then you need to do the work to get that result.
It's
So,
interesting. If I could make a comment, when Joseph Smith was a prisoner in Liberty Jail in the middle of winter, and he'd been there for several weeks, and he's petitioning the Lord, and he's asking him how long. Basically, he's asking him, how long do I have to stay here? And he rehearses to the Lord all of the travails that he's had and the bad experiences by evil people that have been heaped upon him. And of course, the Lord patiently listens, but when he finally answers Joseph, he reminds him that he descended below all of these things in terms of, the torture and the mean and evil people that he was attacked by. And he asked him, the Son of Man hath descended below them all. Art thou greater than he? And so he's telling us that there's things that we're going to have to go through in this life, not because he wants us to go through them, but because evil exists, and how we react to evil is very important, of course. And stick with it, is basically what he told him. In the end, your friends will hail you again, and your family and your loved ones and the people that do care about you are still there, and they're rooting for you. But it was probably had to be, I've thought about that a lot of times. It had to be a very sobering experience for Joseph to go through those. He'd been given a commission by the Lord to accomplish certain things, and here he is sitting in jail and rehearsing all of the evil things that had been done to him. And the Lord tells him to be patient. I've gone through even more than you. is essentially what he tells him in I think it's the 122nd section that he goes through that with Joseph and answers that prayer.
definitely. Yeah. Well, I think that's where the Lord got all his power from.
Everything he had to go through.
Everything he had to go through.
Right.
And because he went through it so well. I mean, you got to think, if you're talking to a tree and that tree has to trust you, then you know what you're doing, and that you're absolutely pure of heart, not only for the tree but for everything else. And for that tree to then listen to you, that tree has to see that you have gone through something, and that you've been stable and you've been good. And otherwise, it's not going to listen to you. It seems very interesting. And I think the Lord got his power that way. That everything he went through, he responded well. And so the powers of heaven could trust him. It could flow onto him. Right?
The Lord could fix all of our problems quite easily, but sometimes I think of the Lord's response when we have a problem, and I think the best thing he can tell us is handle it. He's given us agency. We're here to secure our inheritance. We're here to work out in the gym, develop some muscle. So come on, handle it.
Well, he would also add, handle it and get used to it
Oh yeah, and get
because there's gonna be more.
Yeah, there's always more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he could handle short-term problems or handle them in the short term, but I mean, we're usually the ones who've caused our own problems.
Right.
So they're just going to come back. And I think that's interesting, you know. People think, you know, if I got a new car, I'd treat it well. Well, how do you treat your old car? You know, you don't seem to treat it that well now. And sure enough, when they get a new car, they try for the first couple of weeks to do better, but they slowly sort of slide back into their old behavior. So the Lord could solve the problem maybe short term, but I think we're really good at creating problems for ourselves.
What was that story about Joseph Smith? And I forget who it was, but the guy who he had some sort of, I forget what it was now, but he had some sort of issue, and Joseph Smith healed him, and it lasted for a while, and then he'd come back and he'd have to get healed again.
Yeah,
Joseph
I
Smith's
think he
like,
made the comment that if I could be with you always, we could heal that. Get
yeah,
rid of that permanently. But yeah,
but it's the fact that, you know, it wasn't.
it wasn't.
He
It
could.
doesn't matter how
he
many
could
times you
it
heal
short
it. The
term,
guy
sure,
wouldn't change.
but the guy didn't change his lifestyle.
Yeah.
He didn't change how he acted, or
Yeah,
I mean,
I remember
I
that.
I forget if that he may have been one of the people going around healing people as well, but I don't remember. I don't remember who it was. But
I remember he was under stress all the time.
yeah, he was like one of the organizers, or
And so what happened? He just wouldn't stay healed.
yeah, because he wouldn't do what was necessary to be healed, to stay healed.
I've seen the Lord heal somebody's lungs. You know, they were told to stop smoking and everything else, but they went back to it, and then they ended up with lung problems again. They were healed for a few years, and then went back to it.
Yeah,
Figured, hey, I got good lungs now. I can go back. I don't know. Sometimes I think the Lord could heal things short term, but it's really up to us to change our behavior.
yeah,
Interesting.
every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Now, if
Yeah.
people would actually figure that out, then because that's another thing. They always think that the effects or the consequences of their actions outweigh their actions. But it always says that it has an equal and opposite reaction. So yes, you throw the ball and yes, the ball goes forwards, but it also has an effect on you. So when you do something bad, yes, that goes out into the world and everything else, but that also has an effect on you. And so it changes you when you do something bad.
Of course it
And
does.
so so when those things come back together, when the karma comes around, when the consequences show up, it's not just the outside influence or the outside thing that's coming back to you, it's the inside thing that's coming back to the surface. And it makes it seem a whole lot more, but it's still
It
equal and
always
opposite
seems like
reaction.
it's a worse thing that happens to you, but really it's because you've already damaged yourself.
Yeah,
Yep, of course. And the amount of people that you've damaged too. So it always seems like.
I'm just thinking you throw a ball really hard so it goes all the way around the world and you injure yourself and you turn around or you strain your muscles, then you turn around, you go to catch the ball and it breaks your arm. And it's like that was a worse consequence than what than what I did. But it was exactly the consequence of what you did. You just didn't notice the first part.
Of course.
You didn't notice that first react and that first internal reaction.
Yep.
Because it was something that you thought you could absorb, something that you could handle.
Well, this whole thing is, and for myself, the entire reason that I am trying to share this stuff is really from myself. I wanted to be able to share the way of how to be able to talk with the Lord, actually hear him, get the answers, even be able to see him and talk to him face to face, all of that. And so that is what my initial desire has always been, because this is, I was taught that these things will equal that result. And so I've often, tried to share it for years. There's been times when I just stopped sharing it because, as far as I'm concerned, people are crazy. But I've stopped sharing it because nobody was really interested, and I couldn't find interesting people. But of course, lately, since about 2014, I've been sharing it constantly because because the Lord said so, and that's why I've been doing it. So myself, my desire is still to help people have the information of how to actually get the results. And but it is also backed up by a command of the Lord to go and seek out those people who are trying to get to him, trying to do well, and give them that information. So it's always been my desire to share that information ever since I found it out. It does work. It still works to this day. I know I tell a lot of old stories of when things first began, because I think those stories have the most amount of built-in lessons to those stories. But I still have experiences. They haven't stopped. And it's because you continue to do this program that the Lord has shared, and you continue to do it. You continue to get results, and so it's, for myself, that's why I've always shared it. And it's an odd thing, the responses that we get. Anyways, I guess I'm getting off topic a little bit, but those were my thoughts today. I guess I've been going for more than an hour. Anybody have any comments?
Good stuff.
Yep.
You got to get to the Lord one time or another. You can't just be waiting around forever. I feel sad for people who are waiting for the God of magic to come and bail them out, when the legitimate God has been there all the time, sharing advice on how to extract yourself from bad situations, and how to make your life better and improve, and all of that. So interesting stuff.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for listening to my rant. I guess. Hopefully there's something good there.
You weren't ranting. Very gentle and soft spoken.
That would be another great song, though, something about the God of magic, but you'd have to twist it so we get the right message.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed.
Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay, well, do we have a volunteer for a closing prayer?
Yeah.
Please
Yes.
go ahead.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that we could have this meeting, and we thank you that we could all gather together over the internet. Please close this meeting with thy spirit. Please bless that your angels will be with us and with our family and friends all around the world. And in the name of Yeshua, Messiah, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.